Hello, my name is Dimitri, and in this screencast I want to tell you about the ReSharper software development kit. Now, we've designed the SDK to make the process of developing ReSharper plugins easy and enjoyable by providing templates and examples that will get you making your own plugins in no time at all. So let's begin by looking at where you'd actually find the SDK. To locate the SDK packages, go to the ReSharper product page, JetBrains.com/ReSharper, and then follow the download link. Now that would take you to a page that contains the downloads for the ReSharper SDK. You'll see that there are two separate packages here, an MSI package and a zip package. Let's get them both. So the MSI package, which we are going to begin with, is specifically tailored for actual development. So it's got things like Visual Studio templates and the like. Let's fire up the installer and see where this goes. Most of the installation options are pretty standard. There's the default installation path goes to an SDK folder inside the ReSharper folder. Of course, you can customize it. This just makes it a bit more convenient. There are no options, so just click through the install and let it complete. While it does that, one thing I have to point out is that if you're installing this on a system that doesn't have .NET 3.5, you'll most likely get a warning. That's because, well, most of the demos for ReSharper are done in 3.5, and the project templates use .NET 3.5. And in actual fact, the problem with using pure .NET 4.0 is that the plugin you make will only run on Visual Studio 2010, which is probably not what you want, considering that you can most certainly get the earlier versions of Visual Studio supported in your plugin for free, so long as you use .NET 3.5. So let's wait for this to finish. All right, so we're done. Now, before we close this, let me just point out the option to open the README file here. If we do that, what we get is a small README file that contains some of the general information about the SDK. It tells you what's in the SDK, how to quickly get started, what the samples are. It tells you how to convert existing projects to start using the SDK. And there are a couple of other interesting points, including links to the actual big plugin development documentation Confluence area that we've got. So let's close that for a sec. And now we can actually start using the SDK. So let's fire up Visual Studio. And let's click on New Project. Right. Well, as you can see, if we go into the installed templates, there's a section here for ReSharper 6.1, and there is a corresponding section for Visual Basic here as well. So a total of 6 different templates overall. Let's briefly discuss what these actually are. There's actually 2 project templates here and 1 solution template. The project templates allow you to either create a plugin or create the tests for a plugin. The solution template is the one that we're going to use now. It contains both. And the solution template is preferable if you're starting a new plugin, because essentially it's been pre-wired to connect the tests to the plugin. It's got a test data folder, and it's generally more complete. So let's go for ReSharper 6.1 plugin and tests. I'm going to call this My Wonderful Plugin, like so. Right, so the first thing we see is a dialog box asking us for some metadata that's going to describe our plugin. So I'm going to give it a title, My Wonderful Plugin. Let's give it a description. This plugin rocks, and I'm the author. Let's press OK. So essentially what we've ended up with is 2 projects, My Wonderful Plugin and My Wonderful Plugin.tests. Those projects have quite a few files in them. So let's go through each one and basically discuss what's actually being created. So the first project is the plugin project. Let's take a look at its assembly info first of all. The assembly info file has predictable things that we've entered in the dialog, but it's also got those ReSharper metadata directives for describing the plugin title and description and the vendor. Those are actually used if you go into Resharper Options and pull up the plugin listing. That's where this information gets displayed. So now we go into references, and oh my God, there's quite a bit of references in here. You might be wondering where they all came from. Essentially, the strategy that the SDK takes in terms of adding references to ReSharper is to add every single reference to a ReSharper assembly, including some of the assemblies that ReSharper depends upon. And the rationale for that is that it's very difficult for people to predict which assembly they need or do not need in advance. So what happens when you generate the plugin projects is you get every single assembly loaded. Now let me briefly explain how that actually works. If I unload the project and look at the actual CS proj file, if we scroll down, you'll see that there is an instruction here to add a target file from ReSharper SDK targets. And ReSharper SDK targets is actually a variable that by default locally points to the location where you've placed the SDK that we've installed. So let's go there. Let's take a look at what's actually been installed. So I'm going to go into Program Files, JetBrains, ReSharper 6.1 SDK. There are essentially two folders here. The bin folder is the folder that got referenced from the target files. And I'll show you the target files in a second, but just to explain what's in here, this is basically every assembly that ReSharper comes with. But not only that, it's not only the assemblies that are used for the ReSharper product itself. There's also plenty of things supporting, for example, unit testing, because previously the issue was that you couldn't really do unit testing on plugins unless you were prepared to write your own infrastructure. Now, this is all packaged in these assemblies. The second folder is the samples folder. This comes with the latest snapshot of the ReSharper Power Toys, the actual source code that's been updated to the latest version of ReSharper. And there is also a sample plugin, which is a simpler illustration of how a single concept can be represented as various ReSharper features. So, apart from that, there's only the README file, and that's it for the SDK. But that's not all the files that get deployed. We're going to see the templates. Well, we've already seen project templates now, but there's another thing that got installed. If we go back into Program Files and go into MS Build here, and go into JetBrains ReSharper SDK 6.1, you'll see that there are two target files. And in actual fact, these are the target files that get referenced here. So the plugin assembly would reference plugin.targets, and the plugin test assembly would reference plugin.test.targets. What is the difference? Well, there are two differences. First, plugin.test.targets contains the assemblies for unit testing, whereas the plugin does not. And all the assemblies in the plugin.test.targets target file have been marked as copy local. This is necessary in order for tests to actually run. So I'm going to reload the project and show you what I mean. So if I go into a reference here and press F4, you'll see that copy local is false. But if I go into the same for the test and press F4, you'll see that copy local is true. So that's what we actually got installed in terms of the SDK files. Now let's keep going through the plugin. So well, firstly, there is a tiny readme.txt here reminding you that although you've just generated the plugin, you can already start debugging it just by pressing F5. How does that work? Well, let's go into project properties and find out what's actually set there. So as you can see, the target framework is 3.5. As I mentioned previously, if you set it to 4.0, you're restricting yourself to Visual Studio 2010 and later. So for all intents and purposes, it's better to just keep it as 3.5. Nothing special in the build. There is a the debug section is the one that got modified. So when you debug when you debug a ReSharper plugin, essentially you are firing up Visual Studio, so devenv.exe, and you're providing some command line parameters. There are two parameters that are being provided here. The first is the name of the actual plugin file that you're going to load. This basically tells the Visual Studio that you fire up to let ReSharper know that we want to load this plugin. And the other command is resharper.internal. This basically causes all the exceptions that are generated by plugins to show up in pretty little windows that you can subsequently use to submit the exceptions to the issue tracker, for example, or just being able to see them. The working directory has been set to where your output is. You can, of course, modify all of this later. And that's pretty much it for firing up the plugin. So if you were to press F5 right now, which we'll do in a moment, you'll be able to see that everything has been set up to work. Before we do that, however, let's discuss the other files that have been generated. First is actions.xml. Now, not every plugin is going to use actions, but we figured that most of them will. So actions.xml is essentially a simple XML file. It's an embedded resource, and it tells the ReSharper plugin loader which actions need to be created under the various menus. So for example, here what we're doing is we're essentially saying that under the ReSharper menu, which is this menu, we need to create a My Wonderful Plugin submenu, and then have an action called My Wonderful Plugin.about with the text of about my wonderful plugin. This action ID actually refers to an action that's also been defined in the plugin. Let's take a look at it. It's called about action, and here is the action handler definition with the same ID that we've just seen. And this does a message box saying, this is my wonderful plugin written by Dmitry, and this plugin rocks. Whatever, you can totally modify this however you want. It's just there for your convenience, so that you've got an actions XML file. And if we go back to assembly.info, you'll see that there is an actions XML definition here referencing the actual name of the file. So it's already been pre-wired for you. Get rid of it if you don't need it. So now for some substance, this plugin comes with a sample context action called reverse string action. What this action does is if you place your cursor inside a string, it basically pops up a context action just like this one, allowing you to reverse the string, so put the letters back in the opposite order. It's fairly useless, but it's a good illustration of both how to create part of the ReSharper infrastructure and how to test it as well. So before we get onto the testing part, let's actually run this context action by just pressing F5 or pressing the run button, and let's see how it actually works. Okay, so let's just make an empty project, some demo console app. Let's go into Windows, console application 1. Okay, so we're in. First of all, let's take a look at the ReSharper options, because it will tell us whether the plugin has been loaded or not. So well, you can already see that it has, because our action about my wonderful plugin has been added. If I press it, I get a message box saying, this is my wonderful plugin, whatever. Let's go into ReSharper options anyway. If we press plugins, you'll see that some plugins have been loaded. This is the metadata that we provided. There is an option to show developer information here as well, and that shows you where ReSharper tries to get the plugins. So it's actually a good piece of information for finding out where something went and where ReSharper tried to find it, where the assemblies failed to load, and so on. So we can see that my wonderful plugin, there's just one file, my wonderful plugin.dll, that's been loaded. So everything is good. And so let's close that and try to actually use it now. I'm going to make a string with ABC in it, and if I press Alt Enter, you'll see that there is a option to reverse a string. If I do that, I get CBA. So that's it for actually demoing the plugin. You can see that it works, but let's move on to the tests and see what we can do there. All right, so there's two test files here. There's availability tests and execution tests. Essentially, these are testing different aspects of the context action. So an availability test would look at a context action and say, is it available at this location? Because it really should be. And the execution test actually fires up the action and says, well, is the end result what we expect? So let's briefly take a look at the structure of these tests. Essentially, most of them are fairly simple. They have some sort of a method for creating the actual context action that we're testing, and they perform tests on certain files. So it's essentially data-driven testing using files. Before we look at the files themselves, let's take a look at the properties and assembly info.cs. This is completely different to the assembly info for the plugin itself. Hardly any metadata here. However, there's a class called the test environment assembly that's it's put at the global namespace, and it inherits ReSharper test environment assembly. Essentially, this class is used to let ReSharper know which assembly should be loaded and unloaded for the purposes of testing. In this case, apart from the executing assembly, there's also a type that's there's also an assembly that we're referencing in reverse string action, and that would be my wonderful plugin. There's actually a warning here reminding you that whenever you need to add additional assemblies, you have to put them in here. So this setup has been provided just to make things a bit easier for you. So let me close that. Now, coming back to these tests. Now let's actually open up Windows Explorer and take a look at what's in there. Now you'll see that in the tests project folder, there's also a folder called test. Inside there's a folder called data, and inside this there's a folder called reverse string action. This is a bit of a convention-based setup in the sense that the naming corresponds to what the name of the thing under test is, and you can totally customize it if you want. Let's take a look at the availability test first of all, just see what it actually does. So this is an input file for a test. And what this file is essentially saying is that if we've got this file and the caret is placed at this location, then the context action should be available. And it makes sense because the context action to reverse a string should be available only within a string. So if I were to place the caret, say, in a different location, the test wouldn't work. That's pretty much it. Now let's take a look at the execution tests, which are a bit more convoluted. So the idea is the same, that you've got execute01.cs, and you've also got execute01.cs.gold. So the CS is the starting state, and the gold is the expected state after the context action is run. Now, if we start out with ABC followed by the caret, what should we get as the end result? Well, obviously we should get CBA, and then the caret should still be there. So if I look at the gold file, you'll see that that's exactly what we were expecting. Okay, so now that we have seen how the test data is defined and where it's located, let's try actually running the tests and seeing if they work or not. So I'm going to go into ReSharper unit tests, or run all tests from solution. So amazingly enough, all the tests pass, and that's great. But before we get on to the next step, I want to show you how you can actually add your own tests and add your own plugin items. In addition to the project templates, ReSharper SDK also comes with item templates. So if you go into Add New Item, you'll see that under ReSharper 6.1 there is a number of items here, and there are two different types of icon. There is the icon with the plug and the icon with the two triangles. So the icon with the plug is a plugin element. This is a fundamental building block that you can use to develop your plugin. So for example, if I want a multi-item context action, I would pick it, press add, and I would get an empty file with the method stubs for filling in the actual functionality. Now, if I wanted to test this context action, I would once again go into add new item, and I would pick context action availability test or execution test. So let's press add, and you'll see that there is a to-do instruction here saying that I need to replace this return null with a return of the type that I'm going to actually test. Now you'll notice that in many cases you have to do something like this, and in certain cases it's even more profound. For example, if I go on and add a quick fix test. Now the thing about the quick fix test is that it's a generic type. In actual fact, it inherits a generic type, and the generic parameter has to relate to the quick fix you're testing. So in this case, what we do in the templates is we issue a warning. So we tell you that you really need to replace iQuickFix below with your quick fix name. And that's pretty much it for item templates. Let me get rid of these, because the next thing that I want to demonstrate is how you would set up the compilation and testing of your plugin under a continuous integration system. So I've cleaned up the files. All right, let me save everything. Now the way to set things up is in a CI system is fairly simple. The first thing you need to add the files under source control. So I'm going to do that briefly. Just go into the solution folder, and I'm going to create a Tortoise HG. So I'm going to use Mercurial for this demo. So make a Mercurial repository here. Let me grab a better hgignore file like so. Let's copy that. So we have a repository. I'm going to make an initial commit, and I'm going to add all the files that are necessary. So initial commit like so. All right. And then I'm going to start serving this on port 8000 using this web server command. So right now I've got my Mercurial repository. It's available at localhost 8000. I can now open up TeamCity and try to set up a project for it. So here is TeamCity. I'm going to go into administration and create project. The name of the project will be my wonderful plugin. As you can imagine, go create. Going to create a build configuration and call it default. Nothing to set here, I don't think. Let's get on to VCS settings. So a new VCS root of type Mercurial, and let me get the HG command name. That's going to be used from Tortoise HG. Now I'm going to pull changes from localhost 8000, and let's test the connection. That's fine. Let's save. Right, so after we've got the VCS root set up, let's go and add a build step. Now this is where things get interesting. So I'm going to use MS-build for building this. The build file path is obviously my wonderful plugin.sln. The MS-build version, well, set everything to 4.0 and save that. Right. Before we get onto the actual, well, let's do build triggering as well, just in case, you know, let's add the VCS trigger. And now what's important is that we want to be using those files that have been deployed via a zip file, because on the CI server you might not be able to just go and unroll an MSI. So the way to do it is we go back to our distribution and extract the zip file. So here we go, it's being extracted. Awesome. So this is our folder. It's got the bin file, the bin folder that we've already seen. It's got the samples, which we don't really need, and it's got the targets as well. So on the C drive, make a new folder called ReSharper SDK, and if I take the bin and the targets and just drag them over, that would make a copy of the files. Of course, that's not enough, because right now we don't really know what the target files point to. So I'm going to open up Notepad and I'm going to edit them, and you'll see there's a placeholder saying SDK path here, and this would be filled into the location of the SDK root under which the binaries and the targets and so on live. So in this case, it's ReSharper SDK. So I'm going to copy that and also do the same for the tests targets. Here we go. Okay, so the targets files are okay. They're ready. And the only question is how will TeamCity figure out where the bin files are? So let's get back to our configuration. Now, one of the tricks that we did in the project, if I unload the project once again, is instead of specifying the bin locations directly, we've specified a variable, a condition. And the condition here is that if this variable is blank, then initialize it to the local MS build path. And on a continuous integration server, you would initialize this variable to point to the location of the actual SDK binaries. So if we go back to TeamCity and we go to build parameters, we can add a build parameter. Let's pick environment variable, and this environment variable will be called ReSharper SDK targets, and it will point to C ReSharper SDK targets, like so. Save that. Okay, so that's our project setup. We can actually try running it. Fantastic. So compilation is successful. Now, how do we know that it actually used those ReSharper SDK folders? Well, if we go into the bin log, you'll see that it's using C ReSharper SDK bin. So that's compilation done. Now we can also quickly get the testing done as well. If I go into the build configuration again, so there's going to be another build step that's going to run unit tests. So I'm going to pick an unit, and the end unit runner is 2510. The version will be 2.0 because our plugin itself is using .NET 3.5. So where are the tests actually located? Well, relative to the My Wonderful plugin root, they're located in My Wonderful plugin / My Wonderful plugin .tests / bin / debug / My Wonderful plugin .tests.dll, like so. Right, I don't think there's anything we want to do here. Let's just press save, and then let's run the build again. As you can see, the build took quite a bit more time, but at least now it tells us that 2 tests have passed. We can actually press the tests tab and see what tests were completed. And that's pretty much it for setting up plugin building as part of a continuous integration system. So in this screencast, I've demonstrated ways in which you can set up the SDK and actually start building your own plugins. And I've also shown you how to configure the the plugin to be compiled and tested under TeamCity as well. So with that, I wish you the best of luck in creating your own plugins, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions.